Imagine a world in which socialism worked. In other words, imagine Hayek was wrong, right? And the government really can make better decisions for you and for the economy than you could yourself. That's a pretty weird thing because we know empirically that socialism doesn't work. We know that empirically, analyzing the effects of socialism through time, as well as across situations, across nations, for example. So we know empirically it doesn't work. But imagine a world in which we learned that socialism could actually be made to work. The question then becomes, does the government have the ethical right to impose on you decisions that you wouldn't make for yourself? And the answer to that has got to be no. And that is, I think, a hard thing for a lot of people to get their brains around.
This episode is brought to you by Packrest Botanicals, a libertarian-owned CBD and botanical manufacturing company. If you have a hard time sleeping, insomnia, maybe it's related to pain or restless leg syndrome, try out our nighttime pain relief tincture. It's a 1-to-1 CBD to THC sublingual tincture. You can try it for free, just pay shipping. Go to packrestbotanicals.com. Hello and welcome to the Libertarian Leadership Academy podcast. It's been a while since I put on a podcast, but I wanted to put this podcast on specifically because of our guest today. He is Mike Maat, and he is running for president as a libertarian. I got to meet him for the very first time at the Libertarian Party of Washington State Convention here a few months back. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. It's a great joy to be with you again. Yes. I didn't have to go all the way out to the state of Washington this time, so less technology this morning.
Absolutely. So you have a really interesting background. You spent a couple of decades as an economist, and then you shifted career paths and became a police officer for, 11 years?
That's right. I was on the road in Broward County for 11 and a half years.
So tell me, how does your background, being an economist and a police officer, relate to your philosophical leanings as being a libertarian?
That's a great question. Very interesting way that you put it. I grew up as a more or less a libertarian, coming from what I would describe as the right side of libertarianism, which is to say, I grew up fiscally conservative. My dad had me read Milton Friedman when I was like 18 years old. You won't because you're pretty young, but some in your audience might remember Free to Choose was a book that Milton and Rose had written together in around, I want to say 1979 or so. And my dad made me read that. And that was the first time I really started thinking about public policy at all. And I went to work in the financial services industry, worked in banking, went to graduate school at GW, the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., which was a very free market, very pro-market type of economics program. It's what we call the Rational Expectations School, which is a descendant of the Chicago School, which was a descendant of the Austrian School. And I spent a lot of years in Washington as a free market advocate in the financial services space and had my own business later on in strategic consulting and educating financial services professionals. And all of that was in a free market context. But I didn't come to libertarianism until later in life as a matter of coming to it from what I would call the left-hand side, which is to say the ethical side or the moral side, the idea that, and this is the goofy example that I always put forward. This will sound pretty strange coming from a libertarian, but see how it feels to you and your audience. Imagine a world in which socialism worked. In other words, imagine Hayek was wrong, right? And the government really can make better decisions for you and for the economy than you could yourself. That's a pretty weird thing because we know empirically that socialism doesn't work. We know that empirically, analyzing the effects of socialism through time, as well as across situations, across nations, for example. So we know empirically it doesn't work. But imagine a world in which we learned that socialism could actually be made to work. The question then becomes, does the government have the ethical right to impose on you decisions that you wouldn't make for yourself? And the answer to that has got to be no.
Mhm.
And that is, I think, a hard thing for a lot of people to get their brains around. For libertarians, it's second nature, right? We have the right, the God-given right, to make decisions for ourselves, even decisions that aren't very good. I know that you've never made any bad decisions, Michael, and no one in your audience has ever made any bad decisions, but we have the right to lead our lives by our own standards,
Sure.
to set our own course, and to do so not in the context of some judgment from our government, or for that matter, from anybody else, but irrespective of whether those decisions are good ones or bad ones, it is our right to live our own lives. And so in that sense, at some point you need to divorce yourself from the question of whether or not the government can effectively and beneficially control various parts of our economy. The answer has got to be, it doesn't matter, that we have the right to lead our own lives. And that includes not only decisions we make in a social context, a moral and ethical context, a lifestyle context, but in terms of economics, investment as well. So that's my long-winded way of saying that, having grown up as an economist, made a lot of sense coming to libertarianism from one side. And then I became a police officer in 2010, I think, if I remember correctly. Around the time I became a registered libertarian. And that's when I spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about the relationship between individuals and the state, and how important it is for us to realize that it's not the state's business how you live, how you live your life. And it's important for police officers to remember that too. The reason that they exist is to protect your rights, ostensibly to protect your rights from people who would, through violence or theft or fraud, take your rights from you. But also, and this is something that I didn't appreciate until becoming a police officer, there is so much discretion in police work that it's really a police officer's obligation to protect your rights from the government itself, from yourself, from the officer yourself, because there's, in so many cases, no one else to stand up for your rights but the officer's own discretion.
Yeah, it seems that the government is failing miserably at protecting our rights. It seems that that's the direction that they're heading, and it's getting worse.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. As a matter of fact, I was recently discussing this with my mom, for example, who has seen even a longer span of change than I have. It is true that each the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have left behind agenda that they used to pursue. And now, for example, you don't really find in a significant fashion Democratic politicians who are anti-war, for example. You see RFK Jr. making a splash in this regard a little bit, and he's gotten some good traction for it. Good for him. Similarly, you don't see a lot of Republican politicians that are really fiscally conservative like you used to. And in this sense, the parties have evolved into these organizations whose number one objective is merely to keep the other out of power.
Yeah.
And that's where authoritarianism grows in a democracy. It grows from some politician trying to successfully convincing you in too many cases, that what you have to fear is not the loss of your civil liberties, but what you really have to fear is that other idiot coming to power. And that if you give me more power, me as a politician, I will protect you from that other schmuck coming to power, which is the real thing that you need to fear. And we've seen a lot of that in the past generation, and acceleratingly so, I believe.
Yeah. Well, the danger is that when we give one politician power and that person does not get reelected, the new guy, normally on the other team, now inherits that power. And now they have all that
It does
power.
seem to ratchet up with that ever going back down, doesn't it?
Correct. Yes. We need some type of sunset clauses in everything.
I agree. And, it's funny you bring that up in that context. You hadn't made me think of it just this way before, but it is true that Barack Obama's feeling about how much power he had through executive orders is in no small part attributable to his predecessor, George W. Bush, thinking that he had more power than ever before in terms of what he could do through executive order. And it just continues to ramp up. So at this point, I don't think there's much that Joe Biden doesn't think that he could accomplish through an executive order.
Sure.
I think the relative power of the executive over the legislative branch in our federal government is as lopsided as it's ever been.
Gotcha. So I look at the Libertarian presidential race a lot like Larry Sharpe does. In the way that he explains it, he says the top of the ticket candidates, and this is, state level and then presidential, right? The top of the ticket candidates, they get the most media attention. They get most attention, period. They have the biggest mouthpiece. And then the bottom of the ticket candidates, they have the smallest media presence, but they have the most chance of winning. Right. So as the Libertarian presidential candidate, if you get the nomination, what are you going to be promoting through that position and through that mouthpiece? When you get on 60-second interviews or, couple-minute interview, like what are you going to be talking about?
I think that you've got to be, and our campaign is truly wed to the following concept. We believe that you've got to be out there promoting the most transformational ideas possible. Indeed, as your audience may well know, we have branded our platform. We call it the Gold New Deal. People can read about it at goldnewdeal.org. That'll be my one plug for the day. We believe that not only do you have to have the most transformational ideas possible, but that you have to be so committed to them that people know that you're not going to back off. You leave yourself no ability to back up. That's the idea behind branding our platform, the Gold New Deal. It's got its own URL. So you know that is a real commitment, right? When a politician has a URL, there's no backing off of that. We believe that we need to support a fundamentally new relationship between us and our government. That's the basic idea. That the relationship between us and the federal government is inappropriate. The relationship between states and the federal government is inappropriate. I do not find it acceptable, for example, that the federal government has a direct financial interest in my money. I believe that if the federal government needs to raise money, it should do so through states. It should be required to go to state legislatures for funding. The IRS should not exist as an ethical matter. As a practical matter, we know that it screws up our politics, but as an ethical matter, I think it's an inappropriate relationship to have a direct financial interest from the federal government down to individuals. I believe that it is evil for the federal government to force people into a Social Security program in which they already know that youngsters are going to get a crappy rate of return. Possibly a negative real rate of return after taking into consideration inflation. No young person, knowing everything that there is to know about the Social Security program, would choose to go into Social Security. And so in that sense, the idea of the government forcing you to go into a retirement program that you clearly understand is not good for you, I find that really ethically problematic.
Sure.
I think that the American public is ready to hear an anti-war message that they have not been hearing from the other parties and they haven't heard for some time. The idea that we should not be investing hundreds of millions of dollars in other people's civil wars or other people's any other kind of war unless it directly threatens the interests of the United States. I don't think that Americans have examples of military interventions by the American military that they would point to and say, that was a good idea, right? Notwithstanding, we lost thousands of lives in Afghanistan, hundreds of thousands of foreign nationals' lives in Afghanistan. We lost billions of dollars. In the case of Afghanistan, actually trillions of dollars. But we still think that was a good idea. No, there is no such example. Not Afghanistan, not Iraq, not Syria, not Libya. No, 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 no. And for a long, long time. And so for this reason, I think that Americans are ready for a much more transformational message, and that's what we're going to give them. And in a way that does not allow us to back down, does not allow us to compromise. We have no interest in compromising. And that brands the Libertarian Party as libertarian. We haven't done that in the recent past. The past few presidential cycles, we haven't gone out there with the most principled platform possible, the most transformational ideas. And therefore, we haven't contributed as much to the libertarian brand as possible. For this reason, to your point, we haven't done everything that we could have to support down ballot candidates. When I campaigned for Congress a couple of years ago, I had to spend half my time explaining what the Libertarian Party was.
Yeah.
And the other half of my time explaining what libertarianism is, right? There's just no value in the Libertarian Party brand, and I blame a large percentage of that, not all of it, but a big percentage of that on the national campaigns, the presidential campaigns that did not pursue a real libertarian principled platform. The other thing that should be said, Michael, is that I do believe wholeheartedly, by the way, I do believe that the right electoral strategy is to run with such a principled platform. In other words, I think that if your primary objective were merely get as many votes as possible, the idea that you would compromise on your principles in order to find common ground with Republican politicians or Democratic politicians is dumb. And we've done a lot of that in past campaigns. In fairness, we may not have known at the time how dumb that was. But certainly, empirically speaking, by now, we should have learned our lesson. That doesn't work. Our job is to find common ground with Republican and Democratic voters, most of whom have at least a libertarian streak, not to find common ground with Republican and Democratic politicians. So in that sense, our job is to differentiate ourselves starkly from other politicians. And to do that, I believe you have to run with as principled a platform as possible.
Yeah, so you're going to be attracting libertarians to the Libertarian Party. Is that basically what you're saying?
We're going to be attracting a hell of a lot of Americans because a hell of a lot of Americans are libertarian. Yep. They have a libertarian streak. You can be a registered Democrat and agree that once it's down to 3 candidates, me, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, by the way, that's a weird thing, right? I have a full head of gray hair and Joe Biden's like my mom's age. Okay. That's a weird thing. But once it's down to those 3 candidates, you could be a registered Democrat and recognize that if you're not in favor of our projection of military power for no other reason than to continue our military hegemony around the world, if you recognize that and you don't like it, you should be a supporter of the libertarian ticket. No matter who you're registered with, the Democratic Party does not represent your interests. If you're fiscally conservative, if you've got a problem with the way monetary policy is set up in the United States, and you don't like the fact that every year 5% of your wealth is eroded just because of inflation, if that pisses you off, and it should, by the way, if that pisses you off, you can be a registered Republican. But you're not getting a lot of traction from Donald Trump. If you believe in free markets, if you're a pro-free trader, Donald Trump is not your guy. I don't care if you're a registered Republican or not. He's just not your guy. The Libertarian Party is your natural home. And we're going to get a lot of those people. To your point about attracting libertarians, remember that we're not going after 100% of the population. I think that aspects of our platform will resonate for one reason or another with 100% of the population. But we're not, in terms of support, we're not going after 100%. We're not even going after 50%. Remember, in a 3-way race, 37% wins.
Yeah.
So, you know, the first task is to reach double digits in polls. That's really the benchmark of immediate success. We would not consider it successful if we had to settle for the usual 1.5% or the Gary Johnson 3.5%. That would not be an acceptable outcome. We must reach double digits in the polls the way that Johnson did, but then maintain that, because we're going to give people a reason to hang on to us. We're going to give people a reason to believe that we align with your values, with your ethics, with your political philosophy. And that's what Gary failed to do. So that when he made the mistake about Aleppo, right, and so much support ran out from underneath him, I do believe it's because he had not sufficiently given people a reason to hang on to him.
Yeah.
It's not a mistake that Will made.
Well, I know after the first campaign, he stopped campaigning and didn't restart his campaign until 6 months before the next convention. So, you know, what's going to happen with you? Let's say you get the nomination, right? What's going to happen after that campaign? It's inevitable that the campaign will end, right? What will you be doing after the campaign?
Oh, you mean after November?
Yeah. You brought up Gary Johnson, and I know that he did, you know, he didn't do anything. He rode his bike around, right? You know.
I have no bike, Michael. This is what I do. Okay. This is what I do. We will continue to campaign. It'll be done by supporting down ballot candidates. Down ballot candidates know that we support them a lot already, by the way. You know, that will continue. We'll continue to make our case. We're not going to pack up the campaign and bring it to a screeching halt. That just isn't going to happen. You know, we will continue to find other vehicles. We will continue to work with other candidates. What that looks like and how that plays out is actually a very exciting proposition, but not one that I think that we're prepared to discuss today, because we believe that we're going to make a serious run and play a serious role in American politics in the fall of 2024. And one of the things that I remind people of is something weird is going to happen in 2024. Now, we don't know for sure which weird thing, but we know for sure that something weird is going to happen. Either we are going to reelect a guy who, anybody my age who remembers Joe Biden knows that it was weird that he became president in the first place. A guy who was never very smart, who was never a principled Democrat, who actually had a lot of ethical problems, who is now clearly past his prime in terms of capacity, whose presidency has been a complete disaster, whose popularity among Democrats is less than 50% in terms of wanting him to run again. Either we're going to reelect that guy, which would be weird, or we're going to reelect Donald Trump, a guy who has arguably even greater ethical problems, a guy who is a complete populist, who doesn't have a platform, philosophical underpinning to speak of, who's not pro-trade, a guy who has been indicted numerous times and will be again, including for January 6th, all of which would be weird. Some of those indictments I don't find all that important or interesting, but I do find it important and interesting that he was recently found in a civil court to be liable for a sexual assault. That bothers me fundamentally. I find it weird that a number of Republicans want to brush that under the rug. To reelect that guy would be weird, right? Or the third thing, which is that I will win. Now that would be weird too, right? That a libertarian would win the White House. That would be weird. But not as weird as it would have been in previous cycles, because we know something weird is going to happen. One of those three weird things is going to happen.
So, you know, a libertarian getting elected president, I don't think is weird. Obviously, I'm a libertarian. I think it would be hugely beneficial to society as a whole. and the reformation of government and transformation of government towards one based on non-aggression and self-ownership and voluntarism. Right now, how do we convince the majority of Americans that that is the green or the gold New Deal is what people need to support? How do we get that message across?
I think that you need to remind people that it's time to vote for their values, for their ethics. Most Americans have a libertarian streak, and that might manifest itself differently in individuals. But whatever type of person you are, a Democrat or a Republican, you recognize that our government is going in the wrong direction. You recognize that our projection of military power is not serving our long-term strategic interests.
Mm-hmm.
It is not serving the long-term strategic interests of humanity. It is not serving the interest of you in terms of your fiscal health. It is contributing to the future bankruptcy of the United States government.
Yes.
You can be a registered Republican, but you recognize that the fiscal management of our government has gone off the rails. You recognize that the way that we conduct monetary policy is not in your interest. You recognize that politicians do not represent your ethics and your values when they speak down to the idea of school choice. The simple dignity of being represented as an American citizen, of being represented by a foreign policy that aligns with your personal ethics, values, morals, interests, that's gone. The simple dignity of being able to raise your children the way that you want to, that has been completely undermined in so many states, in different directions, by the way. You can feel one way and feel that your ethics have been undermined in one state, move to another state and see that they've been undermined going the other direction.
Sure.
Because our governments are increasingly authoritarian. Most Americans recognize that, and I believe that polling data show most Americans are sick of the duopolistic control of our politics. They're looking for a third option. And when they realize, A, they have it, and B, that option aligns with your values, they will be open to the message that says, basically, stop wasting your vote. Vote for your values, vote for your ethics, vote for your moral principles, and you will have a politics more aligned with your interests.
Mm-hmm.
Stop wasting your vote on a Republican or a Democrat just because you fear the other one coming to power. The reason you fear them is because you keep voting for a power play instead of for your ethical values.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter who gets elected, a Republican or Democrat, things will get worse, and they continue to get worse. So there's not much difference. When you look at it, the Republicans and the Democrats, Congress and Senate, these guys are all getting paid by big military industrial complex, you know, the donations that are coming in, financial service industries that are, you know, destroying the dollar and destroying the housing market and so many things. And these guys all agree on these core, you know, fundamental anti-liberty platforms.
Ways of doing business that are not in your interest.
Correct. Correct. You know, there was a bunch of votes that came up recently to pull us out of Libya, to pull us out of Iraq, to pull us out of Afghanistan. And there was only 39, you know, for and against was like 200 and something, right?
It's
the majority
amazing.
Of these congressmen and women want us to be spending our money and lives of Americans in these foreign countries to protect the interests of these big corporations over their rebuilding and pulling oil and, you know, stealing the natural resources from these indigenous people there. It's crazy.
It's amazing. All because the American public doesn't realize the truth, because their politicians are unwilling to tell them the truth. You know, one of the things that I found really interesting, Michael, about this recent case, by recent, I mean going back a couple months, this young man, I believe Air Force reservist, who posted the material online that was classified. He's now being prosecuted by the Department of Justice, of course, regarding how poorly the war in Iraq, the war in Ukraine was going. Think about what that means. think about what it means for that information to have been classified. When you consider that the government of the nation of Russia knows full well how that war is going.
Mhm.
The government of the nation of Ukraine knows full well how that war is going. So who is it from whom that our government is trying to keep that information? From us.
Yeah. Well,
You know, they didn't want us to know how poorly that war was going, how poorly a rate of return we're getting on our $100 billion investment. What a bad showing it has been militarily, never mind the ethics, right? But militarily, things have not gone very well for us in terms of effectiveness, and they didn't want us to know about it.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. These wars are not meant to be won. They're meant to be continued. They're meant to be, stretched out for as long as possible so these military industrial complex companies can continue to get the money, because that's where the money's going to. And, then it's going to be
They are
rebuilding
happy
time.
for them to continue ad nauseum. And
Yep.
in the case of Ukraine, even our government doesn't seem to have an interest in bringing it to a close. Clearly, the White House could be pressuring both sides to come to some sort of a ceasefire. It's not doing so. And I think everybody recognizes at this point that a big reason we're conducting this proxy war is to run down the resources of the Russian army and the Russian military. That seems to be objective number one. This has very little to do with protecting democracy, right? If you're fighting a war in Ukraine to protect democracy, you may be on the wrong football field. That is a weird thing to claim as an excuse. We all know that this is a proxy war to weaken Russia. That's all that it is.
Yes. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up, closing up on our half an hour. Is there anything else that you'd like to share to everyone listening?
I want to thank everyone for their support. I want everyone to know that your support is going in the direction that you would be proud of. That we're running a campaign that represents your values, but that we're doing it in a very professional way. We've got 14 professionals on staff now. They are lightly paid, not heavily paid. We've got an advisory team of 12 people. Aside from that, we've got more volunteers on top of that conducting outreach for us. So all in all, we have a huge team.
Mhm.
And therefore, we're going to be ready to go the moment that we secure the nomination next May, toward which we are very much looking forward, as you might imagine. We believe that the professionalism, the credibility, my own personal background in public service and public policy are the correct mix to back up that platform of the most transformational ideas. In that sense, I think that not only are we the leading team to beat in terms of the Libertarian Party nomination race, but we are a team that's going to play a major role in American politics on the other side of the nomination. We're very, very excited about that and encourage everyone to go check out goldnewdeal.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And I got to give a shout out to Lee Koritzer, who reminded me about this podcast and having you on. So thank you for taking the time on a Sunday to join me.
Oh, thank you. Lee is good people, and I'm glad you guys are in touch. I look forward to talking to you again, Michael. Thanks a million.
Absolutely. Have a good one.